The last three sheets of the workbook I'll discuss together. First is the assessment of indicators sheet, and this is where a majority of the work assessing indicators happens. Next is the risk mitigation tab, which allows you to specify risk mitigation measures for indicators where risk is assessed as non-negligible. Finally, the Risk Management Documents tab allows you to place documents that are specifically important for the purposes of risk mitigation and supply all of their accompanying information. So now let's go through each one of these together. The Assessment of Indicators sheet is, as I said, one of the main sheets in this entire workbook. This is where everything gets pulled together. The procedure states that a risk designation shall be provided at the level of indicator and corresponding scale of assessment used. At the same time, each indicator under assessment shall be determined as either negligible risk, non-negligible risk, or not applicable. This sheet pulls together all of the information entered on the previous tabs and is the place where the assessment of indicators is done. So first, select an indicator category. Remember that an overview of these can be found on the Indicators and Threshold sheet. And after the indicator category is selected, then you can select a risk indicator. Finally, you select whether or not that risk is negligible or non-negligible. If you look more closely at the options under Risk Conclusion, you'll see, in addition to negligible risk and non-negligible risk, options for not assessed or not applicable, depending on your circumstance. Remember that if you select not applicable and this indicator is within the scope that you have outlined at the beginning of your risk assessment, then be sure to provide justification in the long description column here. So let's take a look at the Assessment of Indicators sheet with some example data on it, and we'll work from left to right, filling out examples of our own in one of the rows. So first thing you might notice is this button at the top called Worksheet Toolkit. If you click that, some buttons will appear below it that can help make filling out this spreadsheet a little bit easier. I'll explain how in a moment. But to hide this, we just click it again. And to make it reappear, click it again. Okay, so this is the main table on this sheet, and working left to right. So we'll give our new entry a unique identifying number 2. We'll select the indicator category here. So for example, taxes and fees. And if we go to risk indicator and select the button, we'll notice that only those indicators that fall under taxes and fees are represented here. So 6, 7, 8, and 9. I'll select 6 as our example. As I mentioned before, the next item is to select your risk conclusion. So whether it's negligible risk, non-negligible risk, not applicable, not assessed, let's say that this is a non-negligible risk. Now I'm going to fill out the geopolitical scales and the source type to which this applies. Instead of typing in an entry here, notice that this is a drop-down box, and if we click it, you'll see the options Virginia, Oregon, Washington, Texas, Ohio. If those sound familiar, that's because when we were filling out our geopolitical scale tab, the items that we typed in here into this column are now automatically populating the drop-down menu here in geopolitical scale. So whatever you type in the geopolitical scale tab will appear here as an option. Let's say that for Virginia and Oregon, they have relatively the same amount of non-negligible risk when it comes to this indicator. I can select both of those geopolitical scales from the list. In fact, I can select multiple ones. Let's add Washington to the list. You can take states or geopolitical scales off of this list by selecting it again. So I decided against Washington. Go back to Virginia and Oregon. For this reason, if we're filling out the same information over and over again because I want to say now for Virginia and Oregon it's non-negligible risk, but for the same indicator it could be negligible risk, and that might be for Texas, Ohio, and Washington. So you can see that if you have multiple geopolitical scales and multiple source types, that filling out this risk assessment template can get kind of complicated quickly. It's totally possible to have multiple rows with the same indicator listed in each, because what will change is your conclusion for risk, your geopolitical scale or combination of geopolitical scales, and your source type or combination of source types. Note that just like geopolitical scale, in addition to one source type, I can also enter several. Because of this, it's handy to add an option, as we just saw on the drop-down menu at the bottom, for all source types or all geopolitical scales. That's helpful because if you have risk that's homogeneous across all of the geopolitical scales or all of the source types that you've developed, then you can simply select all, if this were an option here, or all source types under source type. And that simplifies the process quite a bit. The way to do that is when you're filling out your geopolitical scale or your source type tabs, be sure to add an option like this, all source types. Note here there's nothing, so I'll go ahead and add all scales, for example, or all states, or whatever you'd like to call it. We'll go back to assessment of indicators, and now that should appear on the drop-down menu. So this can also simplify the work. Another way to remove all of the selections that you've made, say you want to start over, is selecting this empty gap at the bottom, and that will also clear the cell. The way to do that manually is right-clicking, and you can select Clear Contents. That will also do the same thing. I've already included my geopolitical scale. Let's add those back in. I'll add some states here. Let's say this is Ohio and not Washington. There. Now the column for risk threshold allows you to select the accompanying risk threshold for indicator 6. So this drop-down is dependent on the other one. If you change the indicator that you select here from, let's say, 6 to 8, if we go back to this column and look at what's under risk threshold, you'll see that the thresholds have changed to be for indicator 8. So this is automatically linked. Okay. Next, I'll provide a short description of the risk or the issue. A long description of the issue or risk might be smarter to work from the long description first and then compile the short description from that. And now you'll see, along with each risk designation, so non-negligible here and negligible, we also have to fill in how we know this information. So here's the space for references, experts, and legislation. If those column headings sound familiar to you, it's probably because we've already talked about them before, but here they are again. So here's our references sheet, now filled out with some example data from Vietnam. Here's our expert sheet filled in with another set of example data. And here's our legislation sheet. So short reference name, full title, dates of signature, again from Vietnam. So now that I've filled in all of the information on my references, experts, and legislation sheets, I'll go back to the assessment of indicators. And now, just as with geopolitical scale and source type, I'll be able to select the references that I included on the other sheet here from the drop-down menu. So let's say all of these 3 sources were important for me determining that risk designation. I'll make the row a little bigger so we can see everything. I also have my full list of experts here. Let's say Dr. Expert number 2 was the most important expert we consulted in determining that this was a non-negligible risk. I'll select their name from the list. And with legislation, again, here's a full list of all of the legislation that we've entered on the previous tab. So we can select the ones that we've entered previously. Now this is a pro tip. Excel can be a little weird when it comes to drop-down menus. It really helps when it comes to data entry and for making all of this data intelligible. But for now, sometimes it can get a little buggy, especially when the lists get really long. So the way to do this is first you can zoom in. Sometimes that really helps you to be able to click and move this cursor a little bit better. And if that fails, then you can scroll your mouse over the menu just so it's hovering here. And now I'm using the up and down arrows on my keyboard to move through. And I happen to know that the law on chemicals is the most important law that's associated with my risk designation, so I'll select it here. Okay, almost done. So next I'll describe the legal requirements of this law or collection of laws on the risk designation or the risk assessment that I've made. This is different than a simple description of the law and actually should be a description of the law on its own, and it should be a description of the legal requirements of the law with regard to the risk being assessed. So always keeping risk assessment as the key topic in mind. So, and finally, the last column asks to list the limitations of the sources. So, for example, if a source was included, but it doesn't appear to be very reputable, it's possible in this last column to specify the reason. So, for example, one of the links of the sources is a YouTube video. That's probably not a great source, but it's a video recording of a news broadcast by a reputable national agency and did not appear in print form. Okay, that's probably acceptable. So this is the kind of information that we would include here in the limitations of sources. You can also use the limitations of sources column to note that in case a reference is older than 5 years, but it for some reason is still relevant to assessing the picture of risk for the indicator that you've selected. So that's the assessment of indicator sheet in a nutshell. Let's go quickly through and try to fill out an entire column ourselves. So I'll start with a new number, number 3. I'll select third parties' rights, perhaps, and select the indicator that I want to assess, which is regarding the rights of Indigenous peoples. I've already done my research, so I happen to know that the risk conclusion here is non-negligible. And I'll select the geopolitical scale to which that applies. Instead of it breaking down by individual states, I think this is a problem that supersedes all of these scales, so I will click all. With source type, I'll also select all source types because the risk is non-negligible for all source types, all geopolitical scales, so that makes it relatively easy to fill in. Because I've selected non-negligible here, I'll also select the risk threshold that applies. Note that if you select negligible risk, you don't have to fill in a risk threshold. This is only for non-negligible risks. So this risk is non-negligible, so I'll select the reason why. Let's say that there's substantial evidence of the widespread or systematic violation. Okay, that makes sense given my all source types and all scales designation previously. Now I'll move on. I'll start with the longer description of risk, and because I've done my work before, I'm just going to copy and paste from my report into this cell. So I'll say, the reason that Indigenous people face widespread or systematic violation of their rights is, and I will continue. Hopefully it's longer and more detailed than the example that I'm giving. Then I'll move over to the short description of risk and provide a 1 or 2 sentence summary of this longer description of risk that I have over here in this column. Finally, I'll go through and I'll say how I know that. Now, let's say that this is the most important resource for me. But it could be that the option for the reports and academic articles that I referenced isn't yet here in this drop-down menu. In order to fix that, I'll go back to References and start with R4, and I'll type in, this is resources, so let's say Seymour 2003. The author's name is Jane Seymour, the date, etc., and go on from there. Now, when I go back to the Assessment of Indicators sheet, this should be an option for me to select from. So I'll select that. First, I'll clear all, and then I'll select it. Perfect. Now I'll go over to experts and select the experts it pertains to. Let's say expert 1 and expert 3 were both valuable, so I'll select both of them from the list. And then actually I changed my mind and expert 1 wasn't so useful. I'll select that again to take it away from the list. So just expert 3. Finally, I'll select the relevant legislation. Let's say this decision was particularly critical. I'll select that. And just like the other columns, of course, you can select more than one. I'll describe how this legislation, what it requires, particularly when it comes to the risk indicator that's being assessed here. I'll provide, in addition to the description, I'll also provide a sense of the limitations, if there are any. Maybe Seymour is a great author and comes up with a lot of really crucial insights, but fails to mention risk in a particular state. That might be an example of a limitations of source, or it's a bit old and outdated, but it's still helpful because it's the best picture of risk that we have in a national level. I would include that kind of information there. Depending on the scope of your risk assessment, then you'll continue on assessing all of the indicators. If you only are assessing 2 or 3 indicators, then luckily you're already done. We're almost finished filling out our risk assessment template, so now we're on the risk mitigation sheet. The risk mitigation sheet provides space for measures for mitigating each risk that you identify in the previous sheet, Assessment of Indicators. The user, you, can then fill in all of the columns for the mitigation type and further associated information. So the procedure states that where non-negligible risks are identified, mitigation measures shall be established which, when implemented, are expected to reduce the risk from non-negligible to negligible, either individually or in combination with other mitigation measures. At the same time, mitigation measures shall be provided for each identified risk and contain the following information, including classification of the verifier used and other details about the mitigation measures. So the risk mitigation sheet automatically pulls data from the assessment of indicators sheet and allows you to provide additional information. So only those indicators marked as non-negligible from the Assessment of Indicators sheet are pulled in here. As you'll remember, let's go back, we assessed several indicators. 1 was not applicable, 2 were non-negligible, and 1 was negligible. On the risk mitigation sheet, you'll only see those non-negligible risks here, Indicator 8 and Indicator 43, and it pulls in all of the information automatically, the geopolitical scale, the source type, and the associated risk threshold, and a description of risk, but we haven't filled that in yet. So all of these column headings with the dark green, and remember your instructions are always here in the yellow box when you scroll over, all of these dark green columns are pulled in automatically. So Now I only have these two risks that I've identified that now I need to give more information about how I mitigate them. So I'm going to scroll over. So first it asks for a type of verifier. If I'm defining a mitigation measure, I want a verifier to ensure that my mitigation measure is correctly implemented. Some examples of these include field verification of documents, of particular facts, of particular states of being, a do not buy order, document verification, scientific testing, database verification. There's several options here. Remember, if you have issues with the drop-down menu, you can try scrolling in, going up and down, and if that doesn't work, I'm going to just use my trusty keyboard. I'm going to select scientific testing here as my option. Okay. So going over to mitigation requirement level, we have to say whether or not this mitigation measure is mandatory or recommended. Let's say it's mandatory, which means that we're requiring scientific testing in all of these instances to mitigate risk. Now I'm going to put any associated documents that have to do with mitigating this risk here. This is a drop-down menu which is currently empty, and in a moment I'll explain why, and we're going to fill this in together. So I'll unselect that. Risk mitigation measures asks for a text description of the risk mitigation measure being employed. So I've noted that my verifier is scientific testing, and perhaps here I will describe scientific testing will be used on, and maybe I'll list the commodities that it's being applied to. Maybe I'll list the procedure which will guide the scientific testing. Whatever details are important for assessing risk here, you would include. And then other relevant information is the space in case you need to specify additional stakeholders or additional risk mitigation measures that aren't necessarily mentioned here. You can always include this in the other relevant information column. So as I mentioned, this is pulled in automatically. If you try to change this information, it will throw an error. So please stay out of these columns, these dark green ones, and only go to the light green and move. It's an easy fix. Just Control Z to undo and you're good. So now let's go to indicator 43. And we'll do the same thing. Select a different kind of verifier, let's say stakeholder consultation. Let's say it's a recommended measure. And because I'm selecting stakeholder consultation here, of course, I'll want to indicate who that stakeholder is in the other relevant information column. Note that this column is still empty, the risk mitigation measures associated documents. That's because these are linked to the risk mitigation documents tab, which I'll explain in a moment. So let's go there and come back here when we're done. The last sheet we have in the risk assessment template is the Risk Management Documents tab. This tab should only be used to provide additional details of documents that are specifically related to risk mitigation measures that are defined here in the risk mitigation sheet. I'm clicking back over to risk mitigation documents for now. So it asks for several kinds of information. First, a short reference name. So for example, a forest tenure certificate. If the document has a more formal title, please provide that in English here. And please provide the full title in the original language. The date the document is required from. So say the document is required from the start of a year for all people working in a management unit to possess, you would indicate that here. And if a document is no longer valid, but for whatever reason is still relevant for assessing risk, indicate that here. The column that asks applicable to means any entity or person to whom this would be applicable. So it could be forest managers or farmers or whomever is related to the document that you specify here, the person who holds the document, if it's relevant, the government or the institution that issues the document. The signature required by asks who is requiring, if there's a stamp, if there's a signature, if there's something else that's required on the document, who's requiring it. And of course, if any of these fields are not applicable, just fill with NA, no problem. In the last two columns, or last three columns, there's a longer form text that's asked for. So here it's asking for key considerations when checking the document. And there's a few examples here in the yellow box. But the kinds of things we want to know are, when we're checking this document and our aim is to mitigate a risk, what are some of the considerations and questions we need to be asking when we're looking at this document to make sure that it's effective for mitigating that risk? So for example, I might be able to say, oh, forest tenure certificates are only valid for 5 years, and let's say they get out of date really quickly. I might indicate here that it's important to check the validity date and verify that it's been stamped by the municipal government or whoever. In the next column, the purpose and the content of the document, it can be either long or short, but it should provide some description along these lines. We need to know, for example, what a forest tenure certificate is, what it shows us, what kind of evidence it provides, what kinds of content it has, and what its purpose is in general, especially when it comes to evaluating risk. So this is the place to include that information. And finally, in the last column, just like in other sheets, there's a space to record the limitations and weaknesses when using the document as evidence. Let's say it's easily forged, or there's no publicly available database with which to verify these documents. If there's any kinds of limitation or weakness whatsoever, you can record that information here. So we're still on the Risk Mitigation Documents tab. Let's pretend we filled this out completely. So we'll say Forest Tenure Certificate, we've given the full title, the date, etc. If we click back over to the Risk Mitigation tab by selecting it at the bottom, and then we go back to row 3, and look under the column Risk Mitigation Measures Associated Documents. This was previously left empty, but now if we select it, you can see that Forest Tenure Certificate shows up as an option. So as far as workflow goes, you have two possibilities, right? Start with the assessment of indicators, of course, and determine first which are negligible and which are non-negligible risks. That will constrain the flow of information that falls onto the risk mitigation sheet, because remember, it's only pulling those non-negligible risks into this sheet, right? And then in risk mitigation documents, we'll fill out the documents that are related to mitigating risk so that they can be selected here under associated documents. If you know which documents are pertinent to mitigating the risks right off the bat, you can fill out this sheet completely in its entirety and then work through the risk mitigation tab, and you'll have all of your options already there. Or you can work through this row one by one, and if you need to add something to this drop-down menu, click over to the RM document sheet, add it, go back to risk mitigation, and you should see it here on the screen. And that's the Assessment of Indicators, Risk Mitigation, and Risk Mitigation Documents tabs, all at a glance.